support her underlying message, which is education is key. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. We'll now move on to orders of the day and oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 2:59. We'll conclude at 3:59. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it appears that outside this chamber yesterday, the Premier kind of, sort of, almost admitted that he has broken his promise to the people of Nova Scotia to charge the efficiency fee to Nova Scotia Power's profits. He tried to justify it by saying that they believe they have found a better way, Mr. Speaker. What the Premier means is that the government has found a better way to hide the efficiency fee somewhere else on our power bill. Mr. Speaker, just a little over a year ago, the Premier put in writing in the Halifax Herald a document that I will table, pledging that a Liberal government would, quote, force that fee onto Nova Scotia Power shareholders. My question to the Premier, will he now explain to the House why he has broken his promise to the people of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to be able to tell all Nova Scotians that as of January 1st, the efficiency tax will be removed off every power bill in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That's a $46 million savings by households in this province, Mr. Speaker. I'm also very pleased to tell Nova Scotians that shareholders of Nova Scotia Power will be contributing $40 million out of their own pockets, Mr. Speaker, so that low-income Nova Scotians can actually ensure and upgrade their homes around energy efficiency. And I also want to tell him, through the great work of the Minister of Energy, we continue to drive competition in the energy market by putting an efficiency company next door, which will continue to drive down rates for every Nova Scotian in the long run, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Premier can keep repeating his same old talking points as much as he wants. He's not convincing everyone. Even the consumer advocate, Mr. John Merrick, disagrees with the Premier's assessment. He said yesterday on the CBC that this is just a shell game, and I quote directly that when asked if that efficiency fee is truly being charged to Nova Scotia Power as promised, he said, and I quote, "No, it will be coming out of your pocket and mine, and I will table that for the benefit of the Premier." So my question, Mr. Speaker, is how can the Premier possibly keep saying that he's keeping his promise? Who does he think he's fooling now?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, the power rates will be going down of January 1, 2015, Mr. Speaker. I know it's frustrating for the Leader of the Conservative Party to recognize, Mr. Speaker, that not only have we kept our election promise for this mandate, Mr. Speaker, but we've actually created energy competition in this province that will continue to drive down power rates, Mr. Speaker. Equally as important is ensuring that efficiency programs are alive and well in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only thing that is frustrating, not just for me, but for all Nova Scotians, is that they now have a Premier that told them that every dollar of that $46 million would be charged to the profits of Nova Scotia Power, and in fact every dollar in efficiency programs will continue to be charged directly to the ratepayers of Nova Scotia, the very people who are already paying the highest power rates in all of Canada. That is the only thing that is frustrating, Mr. Speaker, and I will go on to quote Mr. Merrick, the consumer advocate, who says Nova Scotia Power will have no interest in keeping efficiency charges down. They are just passing it through their rates. And Efficiency Nova Scotia will be very interested in getting as much efficiency services paid for as possible, again, through our rates. This is not a better deal, Mr. Speaker. A better deal would have been to charge those fees to the power company's profits as promised. Anything less than that is a worse deal and a broken promise. So I'll ask the Premier again, why is he letting the people of Nova Scotia down and protecting Nova Scotia Power's profits instead?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, let me help the Leader of the Conservative Party with what's actually taken place. It actually would be the regulator, Mr. Speaker, that will determine which fuel source is cheaper, Mr. Speaker. But let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, if any efficiency program is charged to rates, Mr. Speaker, it's only being charged because it is cheaper than the source of fuel that is being used now, Mr. Speaker. So in other words, Mr. Speaker, the regulator will force Nova Scotia Power to buy a cheaper source of fuel, Mr. Speaker. That is actually being forced to do that, Mr. Speaker. And at the end of the day, that means power rates are going down. For the life of me, I cannot understand why the Conservative Party would be opposed for power rates going down and more money being in the pockets of Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Coming on the list. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is also to the Premier, and it is also about efficiency, Mr. Speaker. So, contrary to what the Premier has been telling Nova Scotia, ratepayers are still on the hook for efficiency in Nova Scotia. There's no sense of me re-quoting Mr. Merrick. It's already done. It's been tabled, Mr. Speaker, and he knows that. His energy minister knows that, Mr. Speaker. But it's in reality, Mr. Speaker, he wants to tell people that this will be fixed down at the URAB, the same group that I would use the words malign when he was in opposition, Mr. Speaker. And so, you know, one has to ask this question to the Premier. Given that Nova Scotia Power will be allowed to charge ratepayers directly for efficiency in Nova Scotia, where will this be shown on their bill?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in the last 4 years, the only thing we questioned in this province, Mr. Speaker, was the former government, Mr. Speaker, who put a tax on every power bill in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they put a tax on power bills to those Nova Scotians who couldn't afford to pay the bill. What did the former government do? They added another tax to it, Mr. Speaker. And then what did they do, Mr. Speaker? They created a suite of programs that only the wealthiest among us could afford to use. What the Minister of Energy has done in 6 months, Mr. Speaker, has created energy programs that will be funded by the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power to help low-income Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. They removed the tax off every power bill in the province of Nova Scotia. And, Mr. Speaker, they are driving efficiency programs that will only be paid for if they reduce fuel costs.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on his first supplementary.
Finished? Go ahead. Mr. Speaker, now that Robin Hood has had his say in how he's going to help all the poor in the province, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday morning on Information Morning, the Energy Minister said, and I quote, "The only time ratepayers under the Liberal energy scheme is pay is when they are saving money and their money is in their pocket," Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to know, the energy efficiency or efficiency of Scotia can offer incentives, Mr. Speaker, on user pay programs and encourage efficiency program. With changes the Energy Minister has brought forward, Mr. Speaker, they are not here. You will lose such programs, some which would have put $150 back in the pockets of Nova Scotia for installing heat pumps. You know, Mr. Speaker, you don't have to take my word for it, and I'll table this is the briefing document from the Department of Energy. So my question to the Premier is, why is this government considering taking thousands of dollars out of the pockets of Nova Scotians who are trying to make their homes more energy efficient?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, allow the Minister of Energy to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, as the member would know, since he was in government before, Efficiency Nova Scotia is already phasing out those incentive programs. And in fact, what we've done is we now have $37 million from shareholders that will give free upgrades, free deep upgrades to every single low-income house in this province. That is free. That is a $37 million incentive. And moreover, Mr. Speaker, that is a very aggressive plan that will upgrade, and I might add, and I will table, Mr. Speaker, I will table the press release of the Affordable Energy Coalition endorsing that plan.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, all this paper that the Liberals are passing around, maybe they can give it to low-income energy users to burn and keep them warm in the winter, Mr. Speaker. Because, you know, Speaker, the Premier is saying that if every dollar spent on the new Liberal energy scheme truly is helping Nova Scotians save money, then I want to ask him, why should he allow his energy minister to cap the budget at $35 million? If we're saving that much money, why wouldn't he allow ratepayers to put as much money in their pockets as possible?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Energy will respond.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the cap for 1 year only at $35 million is exactly the same program level that Efficiency Nova Scotia had in the previous year. However, they are doing it with less administrative costs, which the previous government was unable to address with them, which is money in the pockets of ratepayers. They're doing it without the HST liability of $4.7 million a year, which is money in the pockets of ratepayers. And in addition to that, they have $37 million, $3.7 million a year to address every low-income home in this province. Mr. Speaker, this, in fact, is a better plan.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Changing gears. During the election campaign, the Premier promised an inquiry into alleged abuses at the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children. In fact, he said, and I agreed with him at the time, that it was one of his top priorities. It has been 6 months since the election. I'd just like to ask the Premier to update the House on when he intends to call the inquiry into the allegations at the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since coming into power, Mr. Speaker, since this government has taken over, we sent a directive to the Department of Justice to reach out to the former residents of the Home for Coloured Children, to Voices, to look at settling, Mr. Speaker, a lawsuit that is before this province. I've been encouraged, Mr. Speaker, by the response through collaboration with all sides. Mr. Speaker, we've continued down the road of looking at an inquiry. The reason one has not been announced, it's important that we allow the conversation that's happening between government and the lawyers who are representing Voices to proceed. And obviously the outcome of that conversation will determine what the inquiry looks like.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer. In the legislature last November, in opposition, the Premier said and he answered, and I quote, that the only person who can make this a reality, the inquiry, is the Premier. And I'll just table that. For the benefit of the House, it has been 6 months. I understand discussions are going on. The Premier knows that an inquiry can be held side by side with any legal proceedings that are going on, and so I will ask him when he intends to call the inquiry.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What the Conservative Leader said is correct, but if you listen to my first answer, I said we've been working in collaboration, Mr. Speaker, with all parties involved. Mr. Speaker, there is a conversation that is happening now around the lawsuit. If we can come, Mr. Speaker, depending on how that lawsuit turns out, we'll determine what the inquiry looks like. That is the conversation that's happening with the people involved. They are going to have the ability to help shape this. Quite frankly, for too long, they were not listened to. They'll be listened to by this Premier.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the calling of an inquiry into the situation at the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children is an area of agreement between the government and the opposition, and certainly the official PC opposition anyway, and one that we're all anxious to see happen for the benefit, first and foremost, of course, of those that were involved, but also so that all Nova Scotia can learn the systemic lessons involved and to put that situation to our past and ensure that we have appropriate laws and regulations in place to ensure it can't happen again. In fact, the Minister of Justice has said that she believes that the former residents of the Home for Coloured Children have gone through enough and put in place plans to have a terms of reference available this spring for all Nova Scotians to see. I understand the Premier's previous answer. I'd like to ask him if we'll see terms of reference for that all Nova Scotians can see for a proper public inquiry in the near future.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said in both of my previous answers, Mr. Speaker, the terms of reference will be determined by what happens in the conversation that is happening now around the legal case. If the legal case is dealt with, Mr. Speaker, then the terms of reference will go towards restorative justice, Mr. Speaker, and how do we continue to allow the healing to begin and to look at what went wrong. If not, if we can come to an agreement, obviously the legal case will proceed and the inquiry will take on a very different look.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today my question is for the Minister of Health. Yesterday, the Minister of Health proclaimed May as Lyme Disease Awareness Month. While raising awareness about this disease is important, Nova Scotians need to see a greater effort beyond a ceremonial proclamation. Will the Minister confirm his support for the people suffering from Lyme disease is more than just a proclamation?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for bringing forth a bill and bringing, in fact, to the House today a Nova Scotian young girl, in fact, who has been affected by and whose life is now impacted by Lyme disease. We at the Department of Health have made a very, very significant move forward over the past, actually, couple of years towards getting education materials in all the right places so that Nova Scotians no longer hear about Lyme disease and that, in fact, it is a growing problem. We now have 17 confirmed cases of Lyme disease causing arthritis in our youthful population. So it is a very, very significant newer disease for Nova Scotia. I know my colleague, the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, has been a very strong proponent in her riding and also as health critics over the last number of years. We have been working to advance Lyme disease as an issue that, in fact, all of our GPs need to be much more aware of. And so I think now we do have a stronger education component for all Nova Scotians, and I think that's going to be the initial strong thrust for us to be able to deal with this disease.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly concur with the Minister that education is key. But while many Nova Scotians have been forced to travel to the United States to be properly diagnosed and treated for Lyme disease, and this is incredibly costly, and they should be able to get the health care they need right here at home. The Canadian Lyme Disease Foundation says that our diagnostics and public awareness are inadequate. We do have highly trained physicians in this province, and they should have the information and resources they need to accurately diagnose and treat patients. So my question today for the Minister is the Minister committed to making sure that our physicians and healthcare professionals are properly equipped with what they need so that Nova Scotians no longer have to travel to the United States for treatment?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite situation I'm very familiar with because back 7-8 years ago I had a couple of constituents who had to take this very journey to the United States. The work of Dr. Stringer at the IWK has advanced very quickly the knowledge among our physician community. Is it at 100%? Probably not. But I think the new initiatives from the department and the professional development that our GPs go through every year have made this now one of the diseases that they need to be more knowledgeable about and be able to make that early diagnosis, because with early diagnosis it can be successfully treated. And so I think we have made great strides, but there is certainly still work to do.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it certainly does sound like many members in this House are on the same page on this issue. So, I mean, the fact remains that people who have contracted this disease have gone through so much. Symptoms include neurological and cardiovascular issues, and a support group in Bedford meets weekly to share their stories and support one another as they go through treatment and recovery. These people have been waiting on the government to take real action for far too long. So my direct question, I guess, to the Minister today is, when can Nova Scotians expect to see a concrete plan to combat Lyme disease in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite has raised a very, very good point that it has indeed taken the medical community some time to really get up to speed, to acknowledge, to understand, and to be able to do the diagnosis. I know that doctors in Nova Scotia now are also involved because they are so significant in educating our doctors and bringing new information to them. I think having determined that May now will be Lyme Disease Awareness Month, I think all of us as Nova Scotians and our medical community in particular will make great strides to make sure that we have that early diagnosis and successful treatment, much more than what we have had in the past, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Mr. Speaker, it's finally spring, and for rural Nova Scotia especially, this means pothole season has arrived. And even though we've just gone through one of the worst winters in memory, this Transportation Minister has decided to cut more than $15 million from the paving budget this spring. My first question, Mr. Speaker, why does this minister think it's okay to cut over $15 million from rural roads after a winter like the one we just had?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member knows or should know that we absolutely did not cut $15 million from the budget whatsoever for local roads. The reduction in our budget is part of the major highway construction injections that we use in consultation with the federal government. So when we make federal agreements, we allocate monies based on that. The NDP, if you look at the same number, the capital number for us went from $80 million to $70 million because the Building Canada funds have lapsed, and we're working on a new Building Canada project and set of projects with our federal partners. The NDP cut the same amount of money by $60 million over their 4 years. And, Mr. Speaker, that's an easy excuse to say they cut worse than us, but that's not the case. The reality is, when we spend on major highway construction, it's tied entirely to our partners with the federal governments. We did not cut local roads. We did not cut plowing. We did not cut salting. We didn't cut any of the things that we have direct control of, Mr. Speaker. We're going to hold the line on those because road safety is what we're all about here.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, everyone's starting to worry about the lines of communications between Ottawa and Nova Scotia. Yesterday, the Premier tried to use talking points to distract the public's fight with Minister Kinney. And back in January, Mr. Speaker, the minister tried to justify his cuts by saying federal funding has gone down. But his own department document shows federal funding actually increased this year. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Transportation give a Premier a lesson on being a bigger person will he stop the Ottawa and Halifax blame game, do the right thing, and restore the provincial contribution on our road budget?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, again, the monies that we put into major highway construction are tied to the Building Canada Fund with our federal partners. With respect to the $5 million that the member suggests the federal government increase, they don't increase funding year over year, Mr. Speaker. We sign long-term agreements with the federal government. We determine that budget line based on which projects we complete. So the $5 million is our own estimate. We could make that whatever number we want, but we made it a true reflection of what we're going to complete this year. And Mr. Speaker, I take a lot of lessons from the Premier. I think the world of him. I admire him, and I'll continue to be under his guidance for the rest of our time here in government. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne on his final supplementary.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, a quick history lesson to the member opposite. Under our government,
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And a quick history lesson. Under our leadership, the previous government, we have spent more money on roads than any other previous government. Thank you for that. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Minister of Transportation threw a curveball to our Conservative from Northside Westman critic. Today, the Minister is pretending, Mr. Speaker, he is pretending to pitch as he's taking our paved roads and turning them back into gravel. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm calling this a balk. My question, Mr. Speaker, can the Minister reassure Nova Scotians that what's happened to Highway 203 isn't a signal of what's to come for rural Nova Scotia? Can he tell rural Nova Scotians today that if they hit a pothole in the next few weeks, this $15 million cut doesn't mean that their road is going to get the Liberal gravel treatment? Thank you very much.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, you know, the road that the member's referring to, we did not say that for sure we would turn that into a gravel road. It's a very low volume road. We're looking at options. It's in excess of 40 kilometers. It certainly needs some work, without question. The Iron Mines Road is one that we have to address. The conversation that was had in the media with our chief engineer Bruce Fitzner said that was one of the options. We certainly have made no commitment to make that a gravel road. We will do our best to do what the people want, and there's a number of MLAs that are affected by that road. So we'll listen, we'll consult, and we'll get positive feedback, and we'll make our decision from there. And with respect to the government, Mr. Speaker, I just want the member to know we're the New York Yankees of government. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe the New York Yankees of government, but they're the Blue Jays of road paving. Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. We know that the Department of Labour has indicated that they will be hiring 12 additional staff for its safety division, including inspectors. And I've been hearing from industry, and they are concerned about how these positions will be filled. The concern is making sure that the people who fill these positions understand the ins and outs and the intricacies of keeping people safe, because that is what workplace safety is all about. And safety should focus on prevention. Employers want their employees, employers don't want their employees hurt. In small business, many employees are like family. Employers do want a safe environment, but they do not want more red tape. So there has to be a balance. So my question today for the Minister is, have the new inspectors been hired, and are they being trained so that they will be assets, not adversaries to business?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new inspectors are working their way through the system. I will let the honourable member know that we did hear, back when we were in opposition, a lot of complaints from business about people being harassed and ticketed with administrative penalties, and that was a huge turn-off to business. And in many cases, the business in fact, was perfectly happy to comply with what the rules were. In some cases, they didn't know what it was, and so they were very frustrated by the fact that there was no education component in the new regime. I can promise the member opposite that, in fact, we are making sure that education is a huge component, because we understand that employers do want to have safe workplaces, and it actually saves us all money when we prevent injuries. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Preventable accidents that are the result of an employer cutting a corner really represent a very small percentage of all workplace accidents. In most cases, employers go above and beyond to make sure that their employees are safe. Phase 2 of the occupational health and safety new regulations will go into public consultation in May, and that's a public consultation period that will only last between May and July, so it's a relatively short window. And I'm talking to employers, and they know that the spectrum of this consultation is very broad and detailed, and they're just concerned that if the department's starting a public consultation in just 3 weeks and they don't have any information of all the specifics of the new requirements, I guess my question for the minister would be, how can the department expect meaningful feedback if it's not working closely with industry on these new regulations?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure the honourable member, and I thank him for the question, of course, that if there are any concerns about the lack of time that it's given to industry and business to respond to that particular process, we will be happy to extend it. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We in Pictou County have a very rich industrial history, and we have a number of first-class employers like the McGregor's Group, Weeks Construction. These are people who put safety first, and I'm sure that they can provide an abundance of useful information to the department on new requirements. So my question to the minister, given her just recent offer there, would be, is she willing to come to Pictou County and meet with me and these employers to discuss safety, and will she do it in May?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I was at chamber luncheon with the Minister of Finance one day when a gentleman from McGregor's indicated that he was actually upset with us for hiring new inspectors, which I'm sure that upon reflection all of us would want to make sure that our workplaces are safe. I would note, Mr. Speaker, that the OSH Special Prosecutor, which many of the members are quite interested in, is proceeding through the hiring process, and we expect to have that new person on site very soon. And I would be happy to come to Pictou County anytime to meet with any of your businesses to discuss occupational health and safety, and depending on the schedule of the House, May is certainly a possibility. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Finance today. I have been hearing daily now from people in my constituency who are concerned, disappointed and angry about the Liberal government's elimination of our NDP government's graduate retention rebate. One such person is Jim Archibald, who forwarded me a copy of the email he sent to the minister just yesterday. Now, I know the minister likely hasn't had a chance to read it yet, Mr. Speaker, so I'd like to read her a passage. Mr. Archibald writes, quote, "It is unconscionable to remove such a program without, at the very least, allowing some type of advance notice, grandfathering or phasing out of the program." And I will table that letter, Mr. Speaker. My question through you to the Minister of Finance is, since she has gone on record publicly now several times saying that she doesn't think that this program will actually retain students in Nova Scotia, Considering her government has no other plan in place to retain graduates, why did they not give students any notice or allow a phasing out period for this rebate?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm always pleased to take questions from the honourable member opposite. Mr. Speaker, I've already explained to the members of this House that this was a program that was not achieving its aim, and that of not only the last 4 years but 7 years of experience with a graduate tax credit, and then after that a graduate tax rebate or graduate retention rebate, had proven to be ineffective to do exactly what we all want, and that is to encourage young people to stay in the province. But, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member knows that young people graduating from university first and foremost must have a job, and in order to get any help, they need to get their foot in the door to get a job, and that's what we will be working on. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, well, apparently Mr. Archibald does not agree with that assessment. He actually goes on to say, and I quote, "This decision flies in the face of the recent Ivany report and will work to send the best and brightest of our young people away. I will remind the Minister that the Ivany report stated that unless our province, quote, increases the population of working-age people, it will not be possible to sustain economic well-being." So my question, Mr. Speaker, is, does the Minister honestly think that getting rid of a program that benefited and helped to keep over 7,000 young workers in Nova Scotia each year is following the guidelines of the Ivany report?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not sure where the honourable member is getting any of her statistics. The statistics that I tabled the other day showed that there were consistently 7,000 leaving the province each year. So I think there's a mistake on the numbers. But however, Mr. Speaker, jobs is what is important. Getting the first job to attach to the workforce, to get people experience and a chance to start their careers here in Nova Scotia is what is most important. And Mr. Speaker, while we're talking about the Ivany report, I'm really so encouraged that everybody in the province is taking it seriously. It has a message that we have to do things that work, and we have to do things differently in our province. And that means we have to be able to look at things that aren't working and really tell it like it is. And it may be disappointing, but at the same point we have to try and put our efforts, our resources and our time into programs that work. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her response. However, I have to say that my constituent, as well as many other people I'm hearing from, feel that the decision to eliminate the graduate retention rebate came out of nowhere. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the Premier was in Truro to talk with students at the Nova Scotia Community College about the Ivany report and said nothing about this cut, which we now know was already in the works. So people are feeling betrayed, Mr. Speaker. My question, too, is that in his letter, Mr. Archibald asked the Minister, why did you not even allude to this cut during the election campaign? So, sadly, Mr. Speaker, we feel that Nova Scotians are now discovering that there are many things that the Liberal Party did not tell the people during their last campaign. My question, Mr. Speaker, through you, to the Minister, on behalf of all the students of Nova Scotia, will the Minister please commit today to reconsidering her decision and reinstate the graduate tax rebate, or at least admit the truth to the Nova Scotian people that her government does not consider graduate and youth retention a priority?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. Again, Mr. Speaker, the truth is this program didn't work, and the third party and the members of the third party would have been more aware of that than I was during the election, because the former finance minister is sitting on that bench. She would have been aware of the cost and the impact and the fact that it was not effective, and that is very true. And in terms of knowing it during the election, why would I and how would I have known the cost and the projections for that? It took somebody to sit down and look at it and do the analysis. And, Mr. Speaker, that was something that happened after the election. Mr. Speaker, there's one other thing I would like to mention. The honourable member is doing something that's happening a lot through this debate, and that is mixing up the interests of students with the interests of young graduates. They're two very different things. The students have their own issues, and the young graduates have issues. Mr. Speaker, the graduate retention rebate was intended to help people who would stay here to get a job, that they would be given some extra money in tax relief or rebate. But, Mr. Speaker, the majority of students that we spoke to and speak to, and many others, Mr. Speaker, could not take the full advantage. They could take very little advantage, if any, because you have to be able to earn a decent big income. In fact, you had to earn the top 50% of income earners in this province to get this income benefit. And so, Mr. Speaker, when you look at it, if it did not do what it set out to do, and there was ample evidence of that, Mr. Speaker, the former finance minister, not the one in this House, but the one before that, actually said on CBC radio that there was no evidence even when it was put in place. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Mr. Speaker, yesterday in question period, the Minister said, and I will quote, "In 2009, there was a law on the books that there had to be a balanced budget. Then another government, the NDP, came in, and that law was gone." I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister through you, Mr. Speaker, if it's so easy to just rip up a law, why is the Minister watching jobs disappear and businesses closing instead of just scrapping the harmful first contract arbitration law?
There you go. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. In fact, Mr. Speaker, when we consulted with business, they indicated to us that they were very happy with the changes that we made to the first contract arbitration bill. And in fact, when we did consultation on the bill, we went to the Labour Management Review Committee, which is composed of both management and Labour, and for the first time in, I think, a long time, there was actual agreement on our amendments. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I've been talking to a lot of employers that are still not very happy. Mr. Speaker, the point of putting it in law is to make sure that it is followed. Like the Ivany Commission goals, putting it in law demonstrates that it is a priority and that it must be followed. Unfortunately, balancing the budget and putting the Ivany Commission goals in law are not a priority for the Liberals. It is obvious, however, that maintaining this job-killing Labour law is. My question to the Minister, when will the Minister start listening to Nova Scotia job creators and finally tear up this job-killing law?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a matter of fact, I was meeting with a number of business leaders today when we were talking about our apprenticeship system and the revamping that we are currently undergoing. I introduced the bill today, and they indicated to me that they're pleased with the way that we're moving. I would note, Mr. Speaker, that a strong, vibrant economy is what we want here in Nova Scotia. Government can lay the ground, but it is going to have to be business that takes the lead on creating jobs here in Nova Scotia. And, Mr. Speaker, I have had actually no complaints recently at all about what we've done with our first contract arbitration.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I think all members of the House would agree that we all want a strong, vibrant economy. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have made it perfectly clear job creation is not a priority for them. They won't put the Ivany Commission goals into law. They won't rip up their job-killing labour law. And at the same time, they gutted the graduate retention rebate program. My question again for the Minister, why won't the Minister rip up this first contract arbitration law?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, again, when we brought in our amendments, we consulted with the Labour Management Review Committee. They were it's got Labour, it's got business people on it. They both agreed with the changes we were making, and we're satisfied with that. I would note, Mr. Speaker, that we need a strong, vibrant economy, and what we need in labour relations is balance, and we believe we've achieved that with that particular bill. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Health. In January of this year, we started learning about the loss of lab services in various hospitals in Nova Scotia, including Parisborough, Spring Hill. January of this year? No, it was January of this year. In addition to the loss of services, Mr. Speaker, the lab technicians are being uprooted from their communities and are being asked to work somewhere else. Some lab technician positions are actually being cut, Mr. Speaker, as of this January. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, can the Minister explain why these good jobs and services are being moved out of communities across the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Sackville for the question. It was an important question because one of the areas that we absolutely know about is that people want services in their community. And while there is some realignment of lab services as a result of the shared services that will go right across the province, right through our healthcare system, education and others, and the one certainty that we will commit to is that every Nova Scotian who is getting a blood test in their community will continue to do so.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has been travelling across the province this winter, meeting with district health authorities. During a visit to Cumberland County, the Minister suggested the decision to make changes to lab services came from the local health authorities. According to one health official, however, Mr. Speaker, this directive actually came from the Minister's office. In an email to the community member of the health official, it states, I quote, as advised previously and publicly, this is a provincial initiative being rolled out in numerous facilities across the province. So I'd like to ask the Minister, my question to the Minister is, has his department directed district health authorities to make these changes that we're hearing about across the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member from Sackville. I think he's well aware that the department's plan to change some of the blood services in our smaller healthcare centres was well underway before I arrived at the department. So it was indeed a department initiative for sure. We also know that there has been great accommodation for the lab technologists to go to the larger facilities, our regional hospitals, where their employment will continue. And as we know, point-of-care testing is now becoming the practice and the procedure right across the country. And we know that while there is some realignment going on, the quality of testing will, in fact, I think, be stronger with this initiative.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, this is more about just getting tests and services. It's about jobs in rural communities, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're hearing over the last little while. And I want to make sure that all Nova Scotians and the members opposite recognize that it was the Liberal government who approved the business plans for the district health authorities across this province. The minister has claimed that this is an issue of human resources and staffing, and I understand that. But my worry, Mr. Speaker, is that instead of finding solutions to the problems of jobs being lost in rural Nova Scotia, that instead the minister seems content to just allow those jobs to be eliminated. So I would like to ask the minister if he's not willing to reverse those decisions that are seeing jobs being eliminated in rural communities, will he at least commit to ensuring other full-time jobs will be created this year to replace those jobs that will be eliminated with this new services that will be provided?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I could respond to the minister by saying, in fact, he was the minister when much of this plan was starting to be rolled out through the department. I can assure the member opposite that our plan around restructuring is to get the strongest system from Sydney to Yarmouth, from Bridgewater to Amherst, and that's the track that we're currently on.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic.
And I'm on a diet. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Transportation. The people of Shabukto Head have been waiting for a solution around ownership and maintenance of the road. Recently, a solution has been put forward involving cooperation between the municipality and the province. The people of my riding are requesting an update around the long-awaited maintenance and ownership issue of this road. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and this gives me an opportunity to talk about the history of federal divestitures in this province. Just kidding, Mr. Speaker. This is, as the member suggested, this is one that is a very important one for the riding and for the area, as the Shabukto Head Road does have a lighthouse. This is being currently the conversations are about divesting to the province, and then the province will take ownership. We'll do a road swap with the HRM, as this is based almost entirely around TIR roads. So we're moving on that. It's fully supported by the HRM. When TIR takes it over, we'll begin to list it and put it into our operational budget. So we're moving on that, and the member can tell his residents we're getting very close. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, the iconic Blue Nose 2 remains in limbo, unfinished instead of on the water sailing. Over budget and long overdue, Nova Scotians are left to wonder when this vessel will sail again. The Premier himself called the project a boondoggle. In November of 2013, the minister admitted that he did not know the true difference between a restoration and a refit. He also admitted he had not seen the vessel in person, saying time did not allow, and I will table those documents shortly. My question to the minister is, will the minister please confirm for the House how often he has visited the Blue Nose 2?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question to the member across the floor. I will tell you that I've recently visited the Blue Nose 2. The Blue Nose 2 is a very extraordinary project. It's a wonderful project. The builders themselves had shared with me, the builders, the designers, and the people who were working on it had shared with me their pride in working on that particular project. The Blue Nose 2 is on track. I expect it to be sailing this spring, and I encourage all Nova Scotians, especially those in here in the House, to go down and see it and enjoy this beautiful project.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January, this side of the House presented the Premier with a list of 55 questions concerning the Blue Nose 2. We have yet to receive a single answer to these 55 questions. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister, can he please confirm...
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Pictou West has the floor.
can he please confirm for the House today, has the Premier shared these 55 questions with him, and can he provide a deadline for when we will finally get these answers returned?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you again. The 55 questions that you were alluding to, most of those questions, actually almost all of those questions, are available to the public, to all Nova Scotians on our website.
Just want to remind the Honourable Minister to direct his comments through the Chair. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in November 2012, the Bluenose 2 flooded with roughly 4.5 feet of seawater while tied to the Foundry dock. All the watertight compartments flooded, proving the bulkheads had failed. Mr. Speaker, the project is overdue and over budget, and now we worry if the appropriate actions were taken after this incident. My question to the Minister, who is the current insurer of the Bluenose 2? And can the Minister confirm they are aware of the previous bulkhead failure? And perhaps provide a date to Nova Scotians that they can expect to witness this icon vessel to begin sailing again?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you. Thank you again for those questions. First of all, I will say that I too, first of all, let me back up. Being the third government in control of this particular project. Third government.
Order, please.
I will assure you.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage. On the question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will assure you that all the concerns that most Nova Scotians and all Nova Scotians have about the cost overruns, the pricing and the delays for this are going to be answered, as I've already requested an audit of this particular project. Now, that said, when we look at the tests, the dock trials and the tests, that's what they are for, to look at all the issues that may come up during the testing of this particular vessel. This vessel...
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you. I assure you that we will look into all the Auditor General will look into all those questions that are being asked, and they will be seen. That said, the vessel is scheduled to sail later this spring. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. A young grad here in Nova Scotia is now looking down the barrel of potentially paying an additional $15,000 in taxes over the next 6 years, if they choose to stay here. The graduate retention rebate was there to encourage skilled individuals to stay here in Nova Scotia, hoping that they would start a new career, settle down with a family, and start a new life. This rebate could provide enough tax and savings to put down payment on a house, pay off student debt, or support a young and growing family. And Mr. Speaker, in an answer today, we heard that it wasn't achieving its goals through the research that they had. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister release all data and research that went into this decision?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite would know, this particular rebate was not under my department, and so I would not be able to provide that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount on his first supplementary.
In an All Nova Scotia article on April 9th, 2014, the Minister of Finance was quoted as saying, "I do understand that some Nova Scotians benefited from this rebate and that they are disappointed, and for that I am sorry. But the fact is, 7 years of experience shows it isn't working." And Mr. Speaker, I'll table that document. In the same article, the Finance Department released an analysis that showed In 2012, 57% of the rebate went to graduates aged 29 or younger. Mr. Speaker, the age group 29 and younger are the future of our province. Of this, approximately 50 million, 28.5 million went to grads aged 29 or younger. So my question to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, does she agree with the Minister of Finance that this 28.5 billion does not help keep skilled young people in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, what we know is that 77% of the amount of money spent on that particular rebate went to older workers. I do not think, Mr. Speaker, it was appropriate for the Minister of Procurement or Public Service, sorry, it keeps changing, that the Minister of Environment or the Minister of Communities and Cultures and Heritage, who would all be eligible for that particular rebate upon completion of their field of study, which they are engaged in right now. I don't think that's an appropriate use of our money. That should have been going to young people, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister seems to be... Mr. Speaker, the Minister seems to be trying to tell the story that this graduate retention credit was not getting to the intended recipients. The fact is there are many factors, including high taxes, lower paying job opportunities, and an aging population, that the government has done nothing about this with this budget. Removing that $28.5 million from the eligible people that was hitting the key demographics, directly, was taken away with nothing to replace it. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, how does it feel to have that $28.5 million cut from the pockets of our youngest and brightest, while offering nothing to replace it? And, Mr. Speaker, people who are going to school now and don't get a student loan aren't going to be available to get the new tax break that they've requested. So my question is how does she feel about cutting that for the people who can take the money?
Excuse me. Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers have expired. Now recognize the Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, during question period, Mr. Speaker, it became to the attention of all members of this House that sadly former Finance Minister Jim Flaherty has passed away at his home in Ottawa. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Flaherty served this country as our Finance Minister, I would say one of the longest-serving Finance Ministers in our history. As all of us would know, we saw some of his health issues appear while he was performing his public duties, and he did continue to perform those public duties in a classy and forthright manner. And on behalf of the people of the province of Nova Scotia, I want to extend to his family and to all those that knew him our deepest sympathies, Mr. Speaker. And before we have a moment of silence, I would like the Leader of the Conservative Party and the Leader of the New Democratic Party an opportunity to respond to the news, and then this House could have a moment of silence.